Welcome, everybody. I'm Lisa Gersdorf, the associate publisher of Frieze magazine, and I'm pleased to see so many familiar and new faces joining us today for this exciting talk. Sorry, now with the microphone. With Basel Abbas and Ruanne Abou-Rahme, who are joining us from New York. We are thrilled to be back in Zurich to co-host this special event with the Migros Museum on the occasion of Zurich Art Weekend. Basel and Ruanne's show at the Migros Museum is titled after their work May Amnesia Never Kisses on the Mouth and is co-commissioned by the MoMA and the DIA Art Foundation. Also, Basel and Ruanne just opened, part of the Berlin Biennale that just opened 2 days ago. So if you haven't had the chance to see either of them, we'll encourage you to go afterwards and see the show. Furthermore, I would like to present, of course, Michael Birchall, the curator of the show from the Migros Museum, as well as Chloe Stead, assistant editor at Frieze. So, and would like now to hand over to Chloe.
I'm going to pass it right back over to Michael, who's going to give a little introduction before I start the first questions.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Lisa, and also welcome to everybody who's in the room with us and also those who are joining us virtually all over the world. It's a great pleasure to co-host this talk today with Frieze. Basel and Ruanne work together across a range of sound, image, text, installation, and performance. Their practice is engaged at the intersections between performativity, political imaginaries, the body, and virtuality. Their work questions the present in a mode of constant crisis, one that is against a different context but not bound within a colonial or a capitalist landscape. Within their projects, they work in a non-linear approach, activating and challenging narratives. They sample materials in the form of amnesia and déjà vu, showing us slippages in space and time. In the exhibition on show at the Migros Museum at the moment, which I hope you'll have a chance to see, we have two interconnected works. May Amnesia Never Kisses on the Mouth. This work examines how people bear witness to and narrate experiences of violence, loss, and displacement, and forced migration through performance. It uses footage from Palestine, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and it showcases song, dance, and performance, as well as expressions of protest. The work is an assemblage of different stories, which confuses the past with the present. The second work on view is Where the Soil Has Been Disturbed, and this work consists of a collage of images taken from the artist archive that evoke memories and symbols from Palestine. It includes dried plants, or thistles, that grow in Palestine where the soil has actually been disturbed, and the plants grow acting as a metaphor to regrow the land and provide nutrients to the soil. This is not only connected to Palestine, but also to other places where people are displaced or disrupted. That's a short introduction from me from the show, and now I actually hand over to Chloe.
Okay. Well, I have the first question, but do we have the participants?
Hi, we're here.
Oh, we can't see you.
Okay.
There we go.
There you are, now we can see you.
Perfect.
Okay, great.
So, thank you so much for calling in from New York to talk to us. I wanted to start with the exhibition's rather poetic title, May Amnesia Never Kisses on the Mouth, which is taken from Roberto Bolaño's Inforealist Manifesto. What does this phrase mean to you both, and why did it feel like an appropriate way to introduce viewers to your work?
Should I start? Yeah.
I think it's quite specific to this project that really started with us collecting material online, and we were very much thinking about how the internet itself is this, amnesiac archive. There is an immense amount of material, but also at the same time, it's incredibly fleeting. It's very hard sometimes to find something that you've seen again. And we're also, of course, dealing with issues of censorship and surveillance online all the time. So it was really, us thinking about those kinds of contradictions of what are archives now and how are they constituted and who is making them, but at the same time, the fact that the archive is constantly, essentially disappearing. And the project for us really started with a very simple practice of us trying to hold on to certain moments, particularly from the revolutions in Egypt and Tunis at the time. So we actually somehow started on this project in 2010. I mean, it changed a lot, but that was sort of the impulse. And it's this call to really resist an amnesiac relationship to time and to history and to witnessing, essentially.
Did you have anything to add, Basil?
No, I think that's kind of, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it touches a lot on the project in general, the title, and like, yeah, I think whatever else we say, I think will come up during the discussion, because, yeah.
I had another question, but actually I'm going to jump in with the next one regarding the archive that you've been working with, because I understand this is an assemblage of material for really a long, long period of time. I'd like to know what actually is included in the archive, how you actually collect or even curate the material, and how you source it, because my understanding of some of the material is that it's been found by, or rather it's been produced by individuals who've been part of those protests, or they've indeed acted in modes of organizing protests in other parts of the Arab communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think I feel that like what the project started with and what we started collecting was not necessarily what we ended up with in terms of, sort of content that we put together online, or the sort of how we sort of then manifested the online component of the project. So essentially, even though that was the kind of material we collected, we never really, the material changed with time, as did the reality on the ground. Slowly, essentially, we started to sort of come across, but also collect mostly material that was, people performing in their living room or people performing on the street. And these weren't like professional performers or professional like bands that because we have a lot of that, obviously. But it was more, more sort of an impromptu sort of thing happening that was then purposefully being documented and shared online by millions of people, and it had like a lot of views. Obviously, when you start digging, there's other things that don't have as many views, but mostly it was like we were seeing this material because it was being shared and circulated. And so the impulse to first collect the other material, I think just kind of carried through, even though the material changed. And we didn't know why we were even collecting it. We just kind of kept doing it. And then at some point it started to dawn, like we started to feel how this material was really coming from communities that were holding on to their communities. So they're holding on to physical space. These were communities that were endangered, that were dealing with violence. And this was the sort of way that they were holding on to themselves and holding on through literal like performance and their voice. And then they also wanted to document it and share it online, right? And so we sort of became involved in that process, even though it started with something else, like in terms of the content and the material, I would say. So that was, I think, the arch of how we arrived and why we started to collect that material. And then later on, it really this material spoke to us in different ways, and we were trying to essentially, all those ideas we were thinking about, how we were sort of, how these communities were holding on to that physical space through these performances and music became a sort of moment for us that we wanted to engage with on different levels, including honoring these practices that we saw as like resistant practices that exist in these communities. And so the project, at least the online component of it, and kind of collecting this material and sharing it and putting it online, really kind of stemmed from that process. because, you know, I feel like, yeah, and that was, you know, the selection, I feel there was, really the selection had many different threads, and like we sort of work in a very, in a way that like opens up possibilities and tries to like, through like that process also have a call in it that opens up possibilities for others to also engage with the material. And that's kind of how we, you know, and at the same time we were, you know, we also trace, so it's not just like we put this material online, but you can also trace that where it came from, right? So you kind of click on it and then you get to the YouTube link that it came from. And so it tries to put these moments together, a sort of like, yeah, just honor them in a way, and kind of when you bring them together, other things start to appear that, you know, and even for us, it's not really, I feel that like we went through a really long process of questioning the power and archive and what does it mean to collect and what does it mean for us to put these collections together. And so we sort of are constantly, it's for us not like a thing that is static, but it's something that is going to keep moving and changing and growing, and all these questions will be sort of asked. And, yeah, it's such a big project, so I'll stop here because I feel that yeah, everything's going to come up as well, all these ideas and stuff. Yeah.
I was just going to respond to that as well and ask about the postscript. So I don't know if people are aware online or in the audience, but the first sort of iteration of the work manifested as a postscript on the DIA website. So if you type in the artist's name in DIA, you can access this incredible assemblage of images, video, sound, as you were just talking about. And I just wondered how you started out with a new commission, a new work with, you know, such an enormous amount of material, and then you created a postscript as the starting point, in effect, or maybe it wasn't like that.
Yeah, well, the whole project was actually meant to basically launch in 2020. And so we were working on, you know, part one of the online component, which for people who haven't seen it, it has a lot of the archive. And it also has some of the new performances that we created. It has songs that have been transcribed and translated. But when the pandemic happened, you know, it really felt to us that we needed to sit with what was happening and not just sort of continue on as though nothing had happened. And we were in New York at the time, and New York was hit very hard. We were also working on the installation, and we had, before the pandemic started, we had begun writing a text about mourning in relation to Palestine that was meant to be the script for the installation, essentially. And the more that we were talking to Dia, the more that we felt that that script really should be the basis of the first thing that appears from the project, because it's all about how do you deal with mourning, how do you sit with mourning, how can you be in this sort of negative space, and they were incredibly supportive. I mean, it kind of made sense for everyone that we start with this postscript. And that's how we also got to the avatars, because we were totally disconnected from, you know, everyone. And you know, the original plan was that the performers were going to be coming here, and we would be opening the show in 2020. And so it was very much about what it also means to be in this state of isolation, and us thinking about how the conditions in Palestine for a moment became sort of resonant with the global conditions, right? So, you know, that's what we wanted to really think about there.
For people, you know, at home or in the audience who haven't seen this online project, the postscript or what came afterwards, it's really kind of enjoyable is maybe the wrong word, but it's really so you can lose so much time like looking at this. Like there are windows that are popping up. It has a bit of a kind of early net art feeling to it. There's video, there's text, there's music. So there's lots of stuff going on. And I think that one of the things that I found so striking about this project was the fact that it feels endless. It really feels like scrolling through the internet, that you're just like clicking, you know, and you can really interact with these windows as they come up as well. And then when I was thinking about you doing a physical exhibition, I thought like, well, how do you possibly translate something so endless, something so lively actually, into a physical space where you have, you know, limited space, time, resources? And I wanted to ask you how you approach that, if keeping some of that kind of liveness or movement was important to you, and where you stop, you know, when you say this is it.
I mean, there's a lot to say about this.
We both want to say something. You go first, because
okay. Well, I think, yeah, there's a lot really to say about this, because I feel that it's actually more or less the other way, I would say. So we always really thought about the endlessness or like liveness, or as like a mode of like being, in a sense that like a mode of opening up possibilities rather than closing things up. So our research practice, but also our like and then that kind of like always expanded to our installation practice, had both the sort of liveness to it, in a sense. I can get into that as well, like how we actually make videos and sounds, and how we've always worked was in this like live mode and setting. So we record things in our studio that we edit essentially, and we sample our own live jam. Yeah, I said I wasn't going to go into it, but I did. But essentially, I think also our research, or also how like our mode of sort of being and dealing with things, but also politically how we think about things, is a sort of this idea of expanding or opening things up for there's a call always in what we're trying to do, but also inviting people for their own interpretation and to take their own sort of thread and open it up to possibilities. And that's kind of how we work in general. So even like our desktop screenshot, you know, works are, you know, they're like a 2D thing, but essentially it's like us sort of researching and trying images and text together, and then that process, and in a way it's like we're kind of like doing live text, and you know, but on the desktop. And that's kind of how we think about it, because there's like endless possibilities. So like a fragment of text can like mean so many things. They can mean things to me and Ruanne that are different. They can bring up different things, and then that becomes sort of part of the web, that's a web of like content that sort of grows. And then the liveness comes from our, I would say, more like music practice and like live visual practice that we do, and then our installations as well. Like we sort of always wanted to carry through that.
I mean, I think that we really, when we were working on the installation, we kept talking about how we wanted it to feel like you're watching a live performance. So to somehow keep that feeling, and you know, it's always a struggle, because an installation is something that like gets like fixed. It has a specific time, and then it has like a loop, and we really struggle with this finite quality of anything, as you can see from like our web platform. Like we don't want to ever close anything. We don't want it to be this hermetic sort of thing. And in a way, so I think we tried to deal with that in different ways. One was thinking about it like it's almost like you're watching a live show. And then the way that we think about the multiple projections, and the way that the projection itself is fragmented. And especially, I think, in the exhibition in Zurich, you know, it's almost like depending on where you're standing and where you're looking, you're actually you're part of the composition of the piece, because every single projection is different. And if you're looking at one projection than another, you're actually going to get a different reading almost, or a different experience. And then we think a lot about how this idea of almost like images fractured within images. So this really thinking about this inability to ever see something completely, right? So there's this kind of fracturing that we try to think about, which we hope keeps this kind of incomplete impulse in the work. So that's, I suppose, how we try to think about it. And yeah.
I definitely had that impression with there are different kind of boards that are being projected onto, and in the conversation that we had yesterday, I was saying that I really felt like it's that experience of kind of having Netflix on and your phone, and then maybe sending some emails at the same time. Like, it has a very contemporary, although it's very engrossing to be in there, it has this kind of very contemporary feeling of just overwhelm, which I think I was getting at with the web project as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of, we are constantly in this like multiple, this kind of multiple gaze. And I think that's really interesting politically as well, because it means that you can, sort of push back against like flattening, right? Flattening situations, or thinking that you can have a hold on, okay, what is really the narrative, or what is really going on. It's actually much more complex than that. And there's all these multiplicities that are also about different times and different places and how they accumulate into each other. So I think it's exactly comes from this kind of contemporary experience of how we see and how we can use that in a kind of provocative way politically and socially, and not just think about it as a distracted gaze.
Yeah, like how can that sort of fragment and that break become sort of something that is a mode of resistance rather than a mode of looking at something that is incomplete or not whole, essentially.
That makes a lot of sense, I think.
That's a really nice segue into my question. Thank you. I'm interested in how the two works on view in the exhibition represent, or rather show, models of distribution and disruption. I mean, you've kind of just alluded it to then in your answer, but that there's a kind of interplay within the exhibition between the two works on show, but also how we experience that as visitors inside the space. I think what you've created with the projections really gives a sense, like you said earlier, that you're very present within this disruption.
I think that disruption is a big part of our practice, in the sense that we're always thinking about how we can disrupt, certain narratives or ways of thinking or ways of seeing, and even, in terms of the sound, we're never, the sound is also full of like disruptions and glitches and interruptions. So there's I think different ways that we think about like the disruptive force of a work, and with this project we were really thinking about this idea of being in the negative or being in something that is broken, and what if something cannot be made whole, and so what happens when it cannot be made whole. So the performances were also very much created by taking, very small fragments from the archive, be it certain sentences or rhythms or melodies, and then just really lingering and staying in that broken part of the whole. So I think that's one of the ways that we're thinking about. And distribution, I think about it like more like resonance, right? How are things resonating between each other?
Yeah, and then the body in the physical space as well. Like the viewer becomes part of that sort of, the projections are also, when people walk in the space and interact in the space, the shadows also come out in the projection itself. And so that sort of also kind of, almost imbricates the body and the viewer themselves, and the body starts to create disruptions, and then so what that creates is sort of like almost like an awareness of your body in the space, and a sensitivity to like everything else that's happening. So the bodies that are being filmed and your body become sort of they start to sort of resonate together in a way with the sound, and then that's it's a physical embodied experience, and that's what we at least hope to sort of achieve. And I think that's also goes back to the idea of with many of our previous works, our characters were always had their backs turned, and you could never see their faces. This is the first work. We had the work before this were like avatars, in terms of the face, and then from the avatars, this is the first time that you see sort of faces. And so thinking about sort of how to implicate the body, and how the body itself becomes a disruptive force in the installation, has kind of been carried through our work, and this idea of the call, and that sort of this character could also be you, and it could be anyone else, and we're not talking about something. We're talking about something very specific, but something that can relate in all ways to everyone else as well. So that's, I don't know if that still answers your question, but that's the sort of line of thinking when it comes to disruption and distribution, I think.
I definitely want to come back to the idea of music and sound, but I had a question to the kind of images themselves, specifically the fact that the kind of installation uses dance as a site of kind of celebration and resilience and resistance, as you already said. And I wondered to what extent this was a kind of purposeful reaction to the images of kind of violence that we often see coming out of Palestine, or the idea even as Palestine as just a site of violence and not one of joy.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'll just say one line, which is I think that this is the joy is actually part of the resistance of, and so to the violence. The violence is there, and these moments are, essentially directly resisting the violence through that.
Yeah, and I would say that, I mean, when we first started working together, we actually never filmed anything, partly because of just the sort of images that were constantly coming out of Palestine, and we felt it was very hard to produce an image there that wouldn't essentially reproduce all the problematic images that we see in the media. And with this project, it was really, for us, we were really interested in the minor moments, or moments that could be seemingly unimportant or even banal, and how these moments are actually incredible moments of like witnessing and testimony and resistance that we really need to look towards and spend time with. And so it was, it was very, important for us to, in a way, like, how can we not always start within a kind of, within like a colonial frame? How can we create our own frame, and look towards things that are very often overlooked? A lot of this material, while it's circulating online on YouTube or on Twitter, it is not necessarily taken very seriously or given that space, or it's not necessarily always engaged with as material to study or think about or think with. And I think that's been really important for us with this project, So definitely, focusing towards like the minor moments or the things that are unseen is really important for us.
In the work that we commissioned, where the soil has been disturbed, you include drawings, photographs, still images, maybe even screen captures, as well as the dried plants from Palestine. I'm really interested in how this work was developed, and also if you could tell us a bit more about the plants, because that truly fascinates me as well.
Well, you probably saw in the installation, we're kind of obsessed with the thistles.
Yeah.
And previous ones too, previous installations.
Yeah, the obsession with the thistles for us started in 2016 when we were going to the sites of destroyed Palestinian villages, and we very often would find the site through the vegetation. So we became really interested in how vegetation itself is this kind of living archive that's also resisting forms of erasure and violence. And so one of the sites that we went to, the whole entrance was just this huge, field of thistles, and they were extremely high, and they were purple, and it was incredibly trippy because they're very beautiful, but also very prickly. And we became really kind of interested in how the thistles, are seen as this like unwanted plant, basically, that people want to weed out. And the more that we spent time thinking about it, we found out that actually the thistles grow where the soil has been disturbed. And when they die and decompose, they actually rejuvenate the soil and allow vegetation that was there before to return. Right, so that was really, vegetation is something that appears, and land is something that comes up in our work a lot. But the thistle specifically became almost, for us, a way to think about illegal people. What does it mean to be unwanted or illegal? Communities that are deemed to be illegal, and how how in a way we can think about the forms of like resilience of these communities through the thistles, essentially, and the thorns. And then, of course, in that we discovered that actually these thistles have been used medicinally
In Palestine.
in Palestine for a very long time for all kinds of different things. So, it very much kind of continues our thinking about how, non-human beings around us are also resisting capture and erasure, and what is our connection to them, and how do we see ourselves in them as well, essentially. So, yeah. Do you want to add something there?
Well, I mean, I think you said it all, but I think the thistle is, I mean, we also have another work that's actually in the Berlin Biennial right now that also thinks about, it's centered around edible thistle that called akub, which is a sort of delicacy in Palestinian cuisine. And there's a story that came out with a young boy called Yusuf Shawamre, who was he goes every year and picks these. They only grow a couple of months in the year on like high mountaintops. So he goes every year and picks it, and so that they can cook it and eat it. And this time he came, and the army had the settlers in the army had like erected fences. And anyway, like basically they assassinated the kid, and they had to release like footage of that. And so we sort of centered the whole project around that sort of moment and that CCTV footage that was. So there we have had a lot, and that's kind of a way that
because they made it illegal to forage.
Exactly, they made it illegal to forage these thistles as well, and that's how, and like that's a way that like they sort of sever connection to land with people, and then that's kind of circles back to the idea of how the thistle becomes relevant in our practice in general, I would say, by now.
I think my next question was also then about land, about borders in some way. That for the exhibition's opening weekend, you invited some Palestinian musicians who you worked with in the video installation to come to Zurich and perform. But unfortunately, for various reasons, these performances had to be postponed. So I wanted to ask, what role does collaboration play in your practice? And what are some of the challenges and restrictions that Palestinian artists face in trying to kind of get their own work out into the world?
Well, collaboration is a really big part of our practice. Firstly, we're collaborating with each other. It's a miracle we haven't killed each other yet. But so we started out. In any case, I mean, Bess and I started working together first through live performance with another like hip hop group in Palestine. That's how we initially started collaborating. We were doing live video and sound. So it's a very, I think for us, like thinking with other people, thinking together and trying to create community is very important, and is why we collaborate. And in this project, we specifically collaborated with these performers, and they had never done anything like this before, so it was really a very different kind
and for
of
us
terrain.
as well, obviously.
And they had to really trust us to do it with us. And they are all people that we have known for many, many years and have been in a conversation with. But I would say also in our other projects, whenever we are filming anyone, that the person that is there being filmed is really someone that we are in a conversation with about the work and is interested in what we're trying to do, or interested in the trips that we're taking together. And so the process of being together and talking about the project and talking about the ideas that are not just our ideas, I mean, they're ideas that concern people in general, becomes a very big
Part of the work.
very big part of the work.
That's why it takes so long too.
And then in terms of the challenges for Palestinian artists, that is very, very real.
The issue of mobility, absolutely.
Unfortunately, it does really restrict artists. It makes it very difficult for them to perform and exhibit internationally, because the visa process is just so difficult. And Bessa and I are like extremely privileged. I had an American passport. He had just a Palestinian. It was very hard for him for many years. And one of the reasons we came here to New York was, for that reason. But it's really limiting, and I think that if there weren't those restrictions, we would know a lot more Palestinian musicians and artists, to be honest, because a lot of them are brilliant. And we also see our work as trying to. The idea of distribution is like redistribute resources that we're getting to support artists in Palestine that don't necessarily have the privileges that we have. So, we also started like a publishing platform that publishes music. So it's like a label, but it also commissions visual artists for online projects. And that's one way that we are also collaborating with other artists and supporting their projects and trying to find a way to get some of their incredible work out into the world.
Absolutely.
So we're constantly thinking about that and thinking about how our collaboration can also support other people's projects.
Well, the project as well, I would say, at its heart, deals with this sort of accessibility and inaccessibility to physical space.
Yeah.
And I feel that is kind of translated throughout the whole work. And when we show the work, these questions get called up all the time, because, we collaborate with people in Palestine who don't have access to space, physical space, as do many communities around the world.
Yeah.
And so this becomes like a sort of, in practice, we are sort of also dealing with these issues that the project tries to kind of think about.
Yeah, I love the idea of this kind of giving back or giving a focus on other people, because I think that it can very easily be within the kind of art world or institutional art world that you become a poster child for a certain place or a certain kind of issue, and then you become the go-to person. And there's a way, of course, as you're just saying, that you can use that that spotlight and then kind of shine it on others, to use a kind of hackneyed metaphor, but.
No, but it's true, and it's very necessary.
And it's actually like necessary everywhere, not just like in the case of Palestine, maybe it is like, but these are sort of, I feel like I mean, I don't like the word ethics necessarily, but I feel that like these are like things that the art world need to think about, and sort of how, how distribution and systems, and how not to sort of to refuse that sort of system of power, and how do we keep within our practice use that
How do
to
we
sort of,
redistribute resources?
absolutely,
basically.
this is a very important thing that needs to be
And
across
build
the board,
community, I think it's
and
really
build
important.
community through that, absolutely.
I
And
had
you
a
kind of
question-
fight the ego. Sorry.
Sorry, can you
No.
say that again?
We lost
I
you
was going
there.
to say that that also goes against the sort of, the singular artist, the sort of ego of the artist, and that sort of pumping up in the art world that kind of becomes a thing that is, that like unhealthy, to say the least.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a question which relates to that as well, regarding music and sound, and how obviously in this work you work with performers who are also musicians and DJs, and sound has always been such an integral part of your work, and I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit further.
Yeah, I mean, I feel our kind of, I think Ruanne sort of brushed up on it a little bit earlier in terms of like how when we first started, we both felt that, the image itself was sort of being essentially like such potent things in Palestine had lost their potency because of the sort of repetition of this image that sort of is meant to represent the whole situation. It was meant to kind of try to sort of portray this like, thing that is a multiple of things. It's not just one thing. And so part of that was to sort of think about how sound, completely sort of think about sound. And one of our first projects thought about how is sound enacted through power. So we sort of we spent 8 months recording at a checkpoint in secret. And then we took all those sounds and isolated them and looped them and chopped them up, and then sort of bringing out frequency in the space. And the whole point wasn't obviously to like recreate a checkpoint, but the whole point was to denormalize that space again. Because
Sonically, yeah.
Sonically, right? So audio became like this way that we could make the familiar strange, that we had sort of almost lost the capability to do with images. And the checkpoint itself had become such a mundane, like crossing the checkpoint became, even for Palestinians, this mundane practice. So people police each other so they can get through, and it's a totally abnormal thing that like we should refuse. We should refuse to participate and normalize the situation and police each other and stand in line. And so sound became this way that we could think about these things, and it sort of denormalize that sort of whole situation. And then all sorts of things came about through that, sort of like how is power enacted through sound, but also how is resistance through sound enacted. And then that doesn't just make you think about sort of formally directly, like how sound is like penetrates all kinds of structures that visual sort of close, but also to think about like music practices and subcultures and how that's kind of always been sort of resistance through sound to sort of oppressive modes of being, right, and living. And so that became a big interest to ours. I mean, I'm also a musician, so obviously I have that, like, I'm originally like a musician before, so I would say that that's part, but then that's kind of how the thinking kind of made its way to our practice as a sort of integral part of our practice and our thinking. So, yeah.
And then I would say, like, for this project, we specifically decided to work with electronic musicians and ask them to only use their voices and their bodies, which is not something that they do usually, but that was really interesting for us. We didn't want to, contact performers that are already performing this kind of material and are very comfortable with it. We wanted that kind of tension, and we very much, we selected things that we thought, they would respond to, and we really spoke to them about this idea of using their voice and their body as the sampler.
Which they understood very well. But
also, the whole process took them out of like a certain comfort zone, and it was very much about sort of almost embodying fragments from this archive and getting into a certain state of being. So there are many times when you're looking at it, it doesn't really feel like a performance. It feels very, and that was something that was really important to us. And then the process of creating the work was essentially us then sampling those performances and creating sonic compositions in relation to the script and to the text as well. So there are many different moments and different ways that we thought about the sound. And now we're doing live performance, so it's like a whole nother level of, like mutation. It's all about kind of contamination and mutation. If you saw the work, all those ideas are really important to us. And also sound bleeds in that way, right? You can't contain it. Right? Sound is something that's very difficult to contain, and that's really exciting for us.
That actually just leads into the last question I wanted to ask before we open to the public. Very quickly, what's next for the project? Where do you see it taking you in the future?
Okay, so that's a lot. I mean, the project itself, I feel that like every time we sort of show it, we work very spatially, so we really adapt the work to the space. We have a third part for the online platform that is meant to be, so the second part of the platform, or I mean, they're not necessarily parts, but the part in the platform that has all this archive material, the idea was, that we transcribed and translated a lot, the idea was we would sort of commission writers and musicians to sort of use that content to also reflect on things and sort of how it relates to their practice. And then that's like a major component of the project that we see moving forward. And then yeah, and then every time we show it, it kind of grows. And I mean, our projects are always worlds, I would say, that we create. So it becomes like a mode of working. Even the, the musicians, we knew them before the project, and we're still kind of working with them on other things. Sometimes their project, sometimes more of our project that kind of falls under the May Amnesia, Kisses on the Mouth. I don't know, like way of working, I would say, which is, yeah, I think we think about it more as a way, a practice, rather than like a project. That becomes like, yeah. And hopefully it doesn't stop.
And we've now started this whole series of performances, which is us inviting other musicians to perform in the space, but also to engage the project, which will also lead to like compositions that will be on this album that we're working on. So we're in an exciting moment now where, it's very much about other people's kind of inscriptions and spending time with this material, and we will continue making work.
Our own inscriptions as well, like essentially,
so it's, it's also like thinking a lot more about performance, like live performance now for the project. Yeah.
Then let's open it up.
Are there any questions in our audience? Yes.
Hi, Basel, and hi, Juan. Thank you very much, first of all, for this wonderful exhibition. And I was just wondering, a usual way how exhibitions are documented or archived is often an exhibition catalog. And it sounds like you have decided to not pursue this. Is that also because you want to make it accessible in another way, or you want to archive the exhibition in another way?
Yeah, are we going to answer one question, one? Yeah, should I just go ahead? Yeah. Yeah, I think that, so there's a couple of things. I think that in a way, the online platform is it's not at all a documentation of the installation, but it is a whole world for the project that we feel we want to think about ways that the installation could also be articulated there online. And the other thing I think is that we very much want to work on a book, but not on a book that's a catalog. I mean, our sort of desire is how can we open this up for other writers to think with the work, not about the work. I mean, I'm sure we'll have one essay that's, about the installation, but like really it's very much this idea of the work also being a call for other people to think about the material. And we started a whole public program at DIA where we invited like Fred Moten and Omar Barada and Jill Cassid, like all really great writers, to start that conversation, and hopefully that will lead to like, written text that's really thinking with the work, So I think that's more how we think about how can the project live on in different forms, right?
Yeah, I feel we also are kind of a little bit, our approach has been like, when we think about documentation, it's kind of like, maybe we overcomplicate it, but we don't essentially like feel that like documentation works with our kind of work in general. I mean, I'm sure it will at some point, but I feel like we always want to think about the thing as an extension rather than a representation of something, so like it's not like a website about the project, it's like part of the project. It's not like a catalog about the project, it's like part of the, it's a book, it's part of the project. So I think that's kind of how we've approached generally these things.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Hello, Ruanne and Basel. Nice to meet you again. I don't know, can they see me? I'm not sure.
No,
I think not,
no. I was wondering, we now spoke a lot about sound, music, and performance. I was wondering, all the text that appears in the video and also the object, where does this come from? Do you have a writing practice yourself also?
Well, yes. I used to write a lot of poetry, which I stopped doing independently and ended up sort of being in our work.
Yeah.
Right? And then, I mean, we basically, writing and text has been a very big part of our practice, and we're very influenced by writers as well. I would say it's a big influence on our
We also
work.
sample text essentially, and we sample our own text as well. So,
but
this one has like 90%.
Yeah, this work is 90%. It's like kind of how we see it, is like a poetic script that we wrote.
And then 10% is like the song, fragments from the songs.
Yeah, but also, poetry is a very big part of like the Arab tradition, I would say, like, sort of oral testimony that is essentially oral poetry, and how that goes into song.
Absolutely.
Is something that we were thinking a lot about in this project, So how is like song as text a form of testimony, and sort of that poetic tradition is something that we try to think about in the project. So we very often write scripts in different ways. This one is mostly written by us, and then we compose sound and image in relation to the script. So it's like almost like almost like the kind of like heart of the compositional process.
Absolutely.
For us. And then
it's like the structure of the piece is always kind of text, and then usually it's like sound, then video, and then back again, like that kind of.
But poetry has been something that's been a part of my life for a very long time, and from my family, and it's a very big part of my own practice.
Thank you so much, Ruanne and Basel, for this very interesting insights to your work. And thank you very much to Michael and Chloe, and of course to the Migros Museum team, especially Tasnim. And it would be great to continue the conversation at the terrace with a refreshing glass of wine. And I hope you will all follow us.
Sorry, Basel, everyone.
Yeah.
Oh, joy.
You'll have to stick with your
Would love to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
So much for having me.
Thank you.